I should have called the police the moment I saw Harold digging that hole. But hindsight is 20/20, and now my golden retriever Charlie is gone, and I'm starting to think my elderly neighbor isn't the harmless retiree I thought he was. It started 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night. I'd been up late working on a client presentation when I heard the scraping sound. Metal against dirt, rhythmic and purposeful. I glanced at my phone. 2:47 a.m. Who the hell digs at 3 in the morning? I crept to my bedroom window and peered through the blinds. Harold Grimsby, my 70-something neighbor, was in his backyard with a shovel, working by the light of a small camping lantern. The hole was already knee-deep and he was still going. His movements were surprisingly vigorous for someone his age, almost frantic. I watched for maybe 10 minutes before exhaustion pulled me back to bed. Harold was always a bit odd, kept to himself, never made eye contact during our brief encounters at the mailbox. But this was beyond eccentric. Still, I told myself it was none of my business. Maybe he was burying a pet or installing some kind of garden feature. People do weird things when they can't sleep. The next morning, I looked out my kitchen window while making coffee. Harold's yard appeared normal. No sign of the hole, no disturbed earth. Just his usual overgrown grass and the ancient oak tree. That straddled our property line. Had I imagined it? The presentation had kept me up until nearly 2. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. But then I saw Harold emerge from his back door with a large bag of something. Mulch, maybe, or fertilizer. He scattered it across a specific section of his yard, exactly where I remembered seeing him dig. The area looked freshly seeded, like he was trying to grow grass over bare soil. That afternoon, Charlie started acting strange. Charlie was 3 years old, a rescue I'd adopted 2 years prior. He was typically calm and friendly, the kind of dog who made friends with every person and animal he met. But that Tuesday, he refused to go near the fence that separated our yards. When I tried to walk him past Harold's house during our evening stroll, Charlie planted his feet and whined, pulling back toward home with unusual strength. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, crouching beside him. Charlie's ears were pinned back, his tail tucked between his legs. He kept looking toward Harold's house and whimpering softly. Dogs sense things we can't. I'd heard that all my life, but I'd never seen it so clearly demonstrated. Whatever Harold had buried, Charlie wanted nothing to do with it. Over the next few days, Charlie's behavior grew worse. He'd pace the house at night, whining and scratching at the windows that faced Harold's yard. During the day, he'd sit at the back door and stare through the glass, trembling occasionally like he was cold. He barely touched his food. I called my vet, Dr. Martinez, and described the symptoms. "Sounds like anxiety," she said. "Has there been any change in his environment? New sounds, smells, neighbors?" I almost mentioned Harold's midnight digging, but stopped myself. How could I explain that without sounding paranoid? "Not really," I said instead. "Try some calming treats. If it doesn't improve in a week, bring him in." The calming treats did nothing. If anything, Charlie became more agitated. He'd started howling at night, long, mournful sounds that echoed through the house and probably woke the entire neighborhood. I was getting complaints from other neighbors, texts asking if Charlie was okay. I wasn't sure he was. On Friday night, exactly 1 week after Harold's digging session, I decided to investigate. Charlie was having another episode, pacing and whining, by the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was unusually quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the distant hum of traffic. I walked to the fence that separated our properties and shined my light into Harold's yard. The grass where he'd been digging was growing, but unevenly. Some patches were lush and green, while others remained bare. The pattern was strange. Almost like whatever was beneath the soil was affecting the growth above it. I'd seen similar patterns in crime documentaries, where disturbed earth creates variations in vegetation. That thought sent a chill down my spine. What exactly had Harold buried? I was about to head back inside when I saw movement in Harold's kitchen window. He was there, standing in the dark, watching me. Even from a distance, I could feel his gaze. When our eyes met through the glass, he didn't look away or wave like a normal neighbor might. He just stood there, perfectly still, until I finally retreated to my house. That night, I dreamed about the hole. In my dream, it was much deeper than what I'd seen, a yawning pit that seemed to descend forever. Charlie was at the edge, barking frantically, trying to warn me about something at the bottom, but when I looked down, I saw only darkness. I woke to silence. Complete, unnatural silence. Charlie wasn't in his usual spot at the foot of my bed. I called his name softly, then louder when he didn't appear. I checked the entire house, kitchen, living room, basement, even the closets. Nothing. The back door was still locked, but when I examined it closely, I noticed scratch marks around the doggy door I'd installed when Charlie was a puppy. The flap was designed for a small dog, too small for Charlie to fit through as an adult, but the scratches were fresh, and there were tufts of golden fur caught in the frame. Had he somehow squeezed through? It seemed impossible, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. I threw on clothes and grabbed my flashlight, then hurried outside. "Charlie," I called, trying to keep my voice low enough not to wake the neighbors. "Charlie, come here, boy." No response, no familiar jingling of his collar tags. I spent an hour searching the neighborhood, checking his favorite spots, the park, 2 blocks away, the creek behind the elementary school, the alley where he sometimes chased cats. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished. When I returned home, exhausted and worried, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Harold's backyard was disturbed again. Fresh dirt, another hole, this one larger than the first. And beside it, Harold himself, still in his pajamas, standing motionless in the darkness. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been something else entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, debating whether to call the police. What would I tell them? That my neighbor was digging holes and my dog was missing? That I suspected some connection between the two events but had no proof? Instead, I called in sick to work and spent Saturday making missing dog posters. Charlie's face smiled at me from a dozen photocopied sheets as I stapled them to telephone poles and bulletin boards around the neighborhood. Several people stopped to ask about him. Apparently, Charlie was well known and well loved in our small community. "He's such a sweet dog," said Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down. "I can't imagine him running away." "Dogs don't just disappear," added Tom Rodriguez, who lived across the street. "Have you checked the shelters?" I had. I'd called every animal shelter and veterinary clinic within a 50-mile radius. No golden retrievers matching Charlie's description had been brought in. That evening, I decided to confront Harold directly. I'd seen him maybe a dozen times in the 2 years since I'd moved to Maple Street, and we'd never had a real conversation. He was one of those neighbors who seemed to exist on the periphery, always there but never quite present. I knew he lived alone, that he rarely left his house except for grocery runs, and that he'd been on the street longer than anyone else. The other neighbors described him as harmless but weird, which now seemed like a generous assessment. I knocked on his front door just after sunset. It took several minutes for him to answer, and when he did, he only opened it a few inches, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Yes?" His voice was raspy, like he didn't use it often. "Hi, Harold. I'm Jack Morrison from next door. I was wondering if you'd seen my dog, Charlie. He went missing last night." Harold's eyes, pale blue and watery, fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. "Missing?" "Yes. He's a golden retriever, about 3 years old. Very friendly. I thought maybe you'd seen him in your yard or—" "No." The response was immediate and firm. "I haven't seen any dog." "Are you sure? He's been acting strange lately, especially around your property. I thought maybe—" I said no. Harold started to close the door, then paused. Dogs shouldn't wander at night. Dangerous things happen to animals that wander. The door shut with a definitive click. I stood on his porch for a long moment, processing his words. There had been something in his tone, something that felt less like concern and more like a threat. Back home, I tried to rationalize Harold's behavior. Maybe he was just a grumpy old man who didn't like dogs. Maybe his comment about wandering animals was genuine concern, not a veiled admission of guilt. Maybe I was letting my imagination run wild because I was upset about Charlie's disappearance. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I spent that night at my kitchen window, watching Harold's house. Around midnight, I saw lights moving in his backyard again. Not electric lights, something dimmer and more flickering, like candles or oil lamps. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on his yard. Harold was there, kneeling beside what looked like the same hole from the night before. But he wasn't digging, this time. He was arranging something around the perimeter, small objects that caught and reflected the lamplight. Bones. Even from a distance, even in the dim light, I could tell they were bones. My hands shook as I adjusted the binocular focus. Some of the bones were small, like they might have come from birds or squirrels, but others were larger, longer, the size that might come from a medium-sized animal, the size that might come from a dog. Harold stood up and began to chant something. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his mouth moving in a rhythmic pattern. The sound that reached me was low and guttural, more like growling than speaking. I should have called the police then. I should have grabbed my phone and dialed 911 and reported everything I'd seen. Instead, I sat frozen at my window, watching this bizarre ritual unfold in my neighbor's backyard. Harold picked up one of the larger bones. It looked like a femur, and held it above his head. The chanting grew louder, and I could swear I heard other voices joining in, though Harold appeared to be alone. Then something moved in the hole. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks with my eyes. But as I watched, something, dark and writhing, emerged from the earth. It was too far away and too dark to make out details, but whatever it was alive. Harold lowered the bone into the hole, and the movement stopped. He knelt again and began covering everything with dirt, working quickly and efficiently. By the time he finished, my hands were cramping from gripping the binoculars. I set them down and rubbed my eyes, wondering if exhaustion and grief were making me see things that weren't there. But when I looked again, Harold was staring directly at my house, at my kitchen window, at me. He raised one hand and pointed. Even. Across the distance, even in the darkness, his message was clear. I see you watching. I ducked below the windowsill and crawled to my bedroom, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever Harold was doing in his backyard, it wasn't gardening or pet burial or any other innocent activity. It was something darker, something that involved bones and chanting and things that moved in the earth. And somehow, I was certain it involved Charlie. Sunday morning brought a new horror. I woke early, groggy from a night of anxious half-sleep, and stumbled to the kitchen for coffee. Through the window, I could see Harold's backyard in daylight for the first time since Charlie's disappearance. The hole was gone, filled in and covered with fresh sod, but surrounding the area where Harold had been digging was a perfect circle of dead grass. Not brown or yellowing, completely dead, as if something had sucked the life out of the earth itself. And in the center of that circle, something was growing. It looked like a plant, but unlike any I'd ever seen. The stem was thick and dark, almost black, with leaves that seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence. As I watched, it swayed gently despite the absence of any wind. I grabbed my binoculars for a closer look. The plant was definitely unnatural. Its movements were too purposeful, too aware, and there was something else, something that made my stomach lurch. Hanging from the lower branches were small objects. Collars, pet collars, dozens of them in various sizes and colors. One of them was blue with silver studs. Charlie's collar. Must have made some sound, a gasp or cry, because Harold's back door opened and he stepped outside. He looked directly at my window and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knows a secret, someone who has been caught but doesn't care. He walked to the strange plant and gently stroked one of its leaves. The plant seemed to respond to his touch, curling around his fingers like a cat seeking affection. Then Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and golden. Charlie's fur. He sprinkled it around the base of the plant like some kind of offering. That's when I called the police. Officer Sarah Martinez arrived within an hour. She was young, probably early 30s, with the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd dealt with her share of neighborhood disputes and paranoid homeowners. "You said your neighbor has been digging holes and you believe he may have harmed your dog?" she asked, consulting her notepad. "Yes. I saw him bury something the night before Charlie disappeared. And last night..." I hesitated, realizing how insane it would sound. "Last night I saw him performing some kind of ritual. With bones." Officer Martinez looked up from her notes. "Ritual? I know how it sounds, but I saw him chanting and arranging bones around a hole in his backyard. And this morning, there's this plant, this unnatural plant, with pet collars hanging from it. One of them is Charlie's. Have you spoken to your neighbor about this?" Briefly. He denied seeing Charlie, but there was something about the way he said it. I ran my hands through my hair, frustrated by my inability to articulate the menace I'd sensed. "Officer, I think Harold Grimsby has been killing pets, maybe for years." Martinez closed her notepad. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're upset about your dog. Pet disappearances are always distressing, but what you're describing, rituals, unnatural plants, these aren't things I can investigate without some kind of evidence. Then look at his backyard. See the plant for yourself. I can't search someone's property without a warrant, and I can't get a warrant based on your suspicion that your neighbor is growing unusual vegetation." I wanted to argue, to force her to take this seriously, but I could see it was hopeless. From her perspective, I was just another distraught pet owner looking for someone to blame. "What would you need?" I asked. "What kind of evidence would justify a warrant?" "Physical evidence of a crime. Proof that your dog was actually harmed rather than lost or stolen. Testimony from other witnesses." She handed me her card. "I'll file a report about your missing dog, and I'll make a note about your concerns regarding Mr. Grimsby. But unless something more concrete comes up..." She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Unless I could prove Harold had committed a crime, the police weren't going to help. After she left, I sat in my living room and tried to think rationally about my options. I could continue watching Harold, gathering evidence of his strange behavior. I could canvass the neighborhood, asking if other pets had gone missing recently. I could research Harold's background, looking for any history of animal cruelty or mental illness. Or I could accept that Charlie was gone and try to move on with my life. But every time I considered giving up, I remembered that plant with its collection of collars. Charlie's collar. I couldn't abandon him, not when I was so close to understanding what had happened. That evening, I began my investigation in earnest. I started with the other neighbors, using Charlie's disappearance as a conversation starter. What I learned was disturbing. Mrs. Chen mentioned that her cat, Whiskers, had vanished about 6 months ago. "I thought he'd just wandered off," she said, "but he'd never done that before. He was an indoor cat, barely knew how to hunt." Tom Rodriguez remembered his daughter's rabbit disappearing from their backyard hutch. The latch was still closed, but Coco was gone. We figured someone had stolen her, but who steals a rabbit? The Johnsons, who lived at the end of the block, had lost 2 dogs over the past year. "Different times," Mr. Johnson explained. "First, Bella, then Rex about 4 months later. We thought it might be coyotes, but we never found any remains." By the time I'd spoken to 8 households, I'd documented 12 missing pets over the past 18 months. All had disappeared without a trace. All had been well cared for animals that weren't in the habit of wandering, and every single disappearance had occurred within 3 blocks of Harold's house. I compiled my findings into a document, complete with dates, descriptions, and owner contact information. It was circumstantial evidence at best, but it painted a clear picture of something predatory operating in our neighborhood. Armed with this information, I called Officer Martinez. "That's certainly interesting," she admitted after I'd summarized my findings. "But it's still not proof that Mr. Grimsby is involved. Pet disappearances can have many causes: coyotes, theft, animals simply wandering off and getting lost." 12 animals in 18 months? I pressed. "All within a few blocks of each other? It's unusual, but not necessarily criminal. I'll add this information to my report, but without direct evidence linking Mr. Grimsby to any of these disappearances." Another dead end. But at least now I had documentation of the pattern. That night, I decided to take a more direct approach. Waited until 2 a.m., then crept into my backyard with a ladder and my phone's camera. The fence between Harold's property and mine was only 6 feet tall, easy enough to scale if I was careful. Harold's house was dark, no sign of activity. The strange plant was visible in the moonlight, even more unsettling than it had appeared during the day. Up close, I could see that the collars weren't just hanging from the branches. They were somehow integrated into the plant itself, growing out of the stems like grotesque fruit. I counted at least 20 collars, ranging from small kitten sizes to large dog varieties. Some looked new, while others were faded and weathered. This had been going on for years. I started taking photos, using my phone's flash to capture clear images of the collars and the plant's unnatural structure. Through the camera lens, I could see details that were invisible to the naked eye: symbols carved into the bark, patterns in the leaf arrangement that seemed to form geometric shapes. I was so focused on documenting everything that I almost missed the sound of Harold's back door opening. Almost. I dropped to the ground behind the plant just as Harold stepped outside. He was carrying something, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and he moved with the purposeful stride of someone following a familiar routine. From my hiding spot, I watched him kneel beside the plant and unwrap his bundle. Inside was what looked like a small animal, maybe a cat or small dog. It wasn't moving. Harold placed the animal at the base of the plant and began his chanting again. The words were clearer now that I was closer, though they weren't in any language I recognized. The sounds were guttural and rhythmic, like something that might have been spoken around prehistoric fires. As he chanted, the plant began to move more actively. Its branches swayed and twisted, reaching down toward the dead animal. I watched in horror as tiny tendrils emerged from the plant's roots and began to wrap around the corpse. Within minutes, the animal was gone. Not buried, not hidden, but somehow absorbed into the plant itself. The branches shuddered once, then went still. Harold stood up and looked directly at my hiding spot. "I know you're there," he said quietly. His voice carried clearly in the still night air. "You've been watching for days." I held my breath, hoping he was bluffing. "Your dog was delicious," Harold continued conversationally. "Young and healthy, full of life energy. The plant appreciates quality offerings." Rage surged through me, overwhelming. My fear. I stood up, no longer caring about stealth. "You killed Charlie, you sick bastard." Harold smiled that same unsettling smile I'd seen through the window. "I've killed many animals, Jack. May I call you Jack? We're neighbors, after all." "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Because it feeds the plant, and the plant feeds me." Harold gestured to the twisted growth behind me. "I'm 93 years old, Jack. I should have been dead decades ago. But my friend here," he patted one of the plant's branches affectionately, "keeps me strong. keeps me vital. All it asks in return is the occasional meal. You're insane. Am I? Look at me, Jack. Really look. Do I seem like a 93-year-old man to you? Now that he mentioned it, Harold did seem remarkably spry for his supposed age. His movements were fluid, his posture straight, his voice strong. I'd assumed he was in his 70s at most. The plant is ancient, Harold continued. I found it in the Amazon 40 years ago, brought it back as a curiosity. It took me years to understand what it was, what it could do. The natives called it Árbol de la Vida Eterna, the tree of eternal life. It's just killing innocent animals for some delusion of immortality. Delusion? Harold laughed, a sound like grinding metal. I was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 1987. Given 6 months to live. That was 38 years ago, Jack. The plant doesn't just extend life, it improves it. I'm stronger now than I was at 50. I pulled out my phone, realizing I'd been recording everything. The camera had captured Harold's confession, the strange plant, everything. You won't leave here with that recording, Harold said, noticing my phone. Watch me. I turned to run, but something wrapped around my ankle. Looking down, I saw one of the plant's tendrils had somehow extended across the yard to grab me. More tendrils were emerging from the ground, reaching for my arms and legs. I yanked my foot free and sprinted toward the fence, but the tendrils were faster. They caught me before I'd taken 3 steps, wrapping around my limbs with surprising strength. Harold walked over casually as I struggled against the plant's grip. You know, Jack, I've been thinking about getting a new pet myself. Something loyal and obedient. The plant can do more than just preserve life. It can reshape it. The tendrils began to pull me toward the base of the plant, where the earth was soft and dark. I could see bones mixed in with the soil, animal bones and what looked disturbingly like human remains. Don't worry, Harold said soothingly. You'll still be you, mostly. Just improved, more compliant. The plant is very skilled at preserving the essential personality while removing troublesome traits like curiosity and independence. I was almost to the plant's base when I heard sirens in the distance. Harold frowned and tilted his head, listening. Did you call the police before coming over here, Jack? How thoughtful. The sirens were getting closer. I'd programmed Officer Martinez's number into my phone, set to auto-dial if I pressed the emergency sequence. I must have triggered it accidentally during my struggle with the tendrils. No matter, Harold said. We'll just have to work quickly. The tendrils tightened around me, pulling me down into the soft earth. I could feel the plant's roots moving beneath the soil, preparing to begin their work. But then the tendrils suddenly loosened. Harold was backing away from the plant, his confident expression replaced by something approaching fear. No, he whispered. Not yet. The police will complicate things. The plant seemed to disagree. Its branches thrashed angrily, and Harold cried out as one of them struck him across the face, leaving deep scratches. I've fed you for 40 years, Harold shouted. You owe me obedience. The plant's response was to grab Harold with the same tendrils that had been holding me. He struggled and cursed, but the plant was stronger. Much stronger than it had been just moments before. As the sirens reached our street, I watched Harold Grimsby disappear into the earth beneath his unnatural garden, his screams muffled by the dark soil. The tendrils released me completely, and I scrambled to my feet just as flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Over here, I shouted, waving toward the fence, in the backyard. Officer Martinez and 2 other officers found me standing next to the plant, which had gone completely still. In the harsh light of their flashlights, it looked almost normal, just an unusual garden specimen surrounded by disturbed earth. Where's Mr. Grimsby? Martinez asked, looking around the yard. The plant, I said, pointing to the base where Harold had vanished. It pulled him under. The officers exchanged glances that clearly said they thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Sir, we need you to step away from the garden and come with us, one of them said gently. I started to argue, then realized how insane I must sound. Instead, I held up my phone. I recorded everything. Harold confessing to killing pets, the plant moving on its own, everything. Martinez took my phone and scrolled through the video. Her expression changed as she watched, shifting from skepticism to concern to outright alarm. "Call for backup," she told one of the other officers, "and get someone from the coroner's office down here. We're going to need to excavate this entire yard." The excavation took 3 days. What they found beneath Harold's garden made national news. The remains of 47 animals ranging from cats and dogs to larger animals like sheep and goats. Human remains as well. 5 adults and 2 children, some dating back decades. And at the center of it all, the twisted root system of something that shouldn't have been able to exist. Harold Grimsby's body was never found, though the disturbed earth suggested something had been buried and then moved. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. The plant itself was removed by specialists from the agricultural department, who claimed it was an unknown species possibly brought from South America. They said it showed signs of genetic modification, though they couldn't explain how or by whom. I never told them about Harold's confession or his claims of immortality. Who would have believed it? Charlie's remains were identified among those found in the garden. The vet confirmed he'd been dead for less than a week, which meant Harold had kept him alive for several days before feeding him to that thing. I buried Charlie in a proper pet cemetery across town, as far from Maple Street as I could manage. I also moved out of the neighborhood within a month. I couldn't stand looking at Harold's empty house or the bare patch of earth where his garden had been. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I think about Harold's last words about the plant owing him obedience, about how it had turned on him when the police arrived, as if it understood the danger they represented. And I wonder if somewhere, beneath the concrete that now covers Harold's former backyard, something is still waiting, still growing, still hungry. The other missing pets were never found, and their owners have moved on with their lives. But I keep their pictures on my desk at work, a reminder that some mysteries are never fully solved, some hungers are never fully satisfied, and some neighbors are never what they seem.